Welcome everybody to our March Canada Wildfire webinar. I'm really pleased to welcome you all here today on International Women's Day. I'm really excited about the topic. We're going to be learning about science communications, podcasts, and we have two really great speakers here. I'm coming to you from Treaty 6 territory, so I'm in what is now known as Leduc, Alberta. I'm very happy to be a welcome settler at this location. So I'd like us all to take a moment to think about the places where we live, work, and play, and the people who held the land and continue to hold the land. So thinking about where we come from is hitting me a little bit differently today, with it being International Women's Day and having listened to the primer for season 3 of Good Fire and thinking about matriarchs and those strong women who are such leaders in so many communities. And I'm really excited for season 3 of Good Fire to come out. And I'm extra excited to have Matthew Kristoff and Amy Cardinal Christianson here today to talk to us about the making of the podcast and give us a bit of a behind the scenes look of how they've done this podcast, but also how to do proper science communication and how to be inclusive with how you do that. We are going to have our normal format where if any questions come up during the presentation, please post them in the chat box. When Amy and Matthew are done, I will then revert to the chat and I will express your questions to them in a Q&A at the end of the presentation. This is being recorded and will be posted to our YouTube channel early next week. So with that, I would like to warmly welcome Matthew and Amy. I'm so happy to have you both here today.
Thanks for having us.
And I'm going to hand you guys the reins. I'm really looking forward to this presentation.
Thanks, Karen. Can you see and hear us okay?
Yeah, you're perfect.
Okay, sounds good. I think I've got a little bit of a screen sharing delay, but I'll just try to be patient here. Okay, there we go. So yeah, we're really happy to share about our podcast today and kind of behind the scenes in science communication. But as Karen mentioned, today is International Women's Day, and I also just wanted to, mention the missing and murdered Indigenous women and Two-Spirit people as well. Like, I think today is a really important day to recognize that as well. We've made a lot of advances for women over the last few years, but we still have a significant portion of our population in Canada, that is like, basically still has a lot of impacts on them. And so, yeah, just bringing that again to everyone's attention, and this beautiful piece of artwork that I found that kind of recognizes the day. So yeah, thanks for letting me share that. And so just here for our contact information. So we'll make the PDF available, or you can take a picture of it or whatever. So I'm Amy. I'm a Métis from Treaty 8 territory. I live in Treaty 6 right now in Rocky Mountain House, Alberta. I'm currently, for a few more weeks, an Indigenous fire specialist with Parks Canada. And yeah, I'm one of the co-hosts of the Good Fire. And so I'll pass it to Matt for an intro.
Morning, everyone. Yeah, my name is Matthew Kristoff. I'm forester here in Edmonton, and yeah, I also host a podcast called YourForest, and then I co-host and produce Good Fire with Amy, and yeah, that's how I got into the podcasting thing, was through a forestry lens, and got to meet Amy and opened up a lot of doors into learning about a lot of things. So I'm excited to be here today to tell you what I've learned.
Perfect. So I think this is going to be a little bit of a different talk for Canada Wildfire, but really wanted to thank the team there for inviting us to do this. So yeah, it's going to be a lot about science communication and basically how we get our message out. But first, I wanted to share like a bit of my background and the work that I do. And, and basically we're going to tell the story of how the podcast came to be. So my research is primarily focused around Indigenous fire stewardship. And so Indigenous fire stewardship is basically how Indigenous people steward their environment, and through fire, through using fire, through reacting to fires on the Earth's landscape. And so this is a great figure from Kira Hoffman, an article that we wrote in Facets, the team. And so it basically just shows that for Indigenous fire, for cultural burning specifically, it's really kind of a circular yearly event that's around the seasons and the times to burn. And so usually the burning that we do, it's to achieve different cultural objectives. And a side benefit is that it also reduces wildfire risk by reducing the fuel load. And so we generally in Canada tend to burn around the snowfall. And basically every nation is different in how and when they burn, techniques that they use, reasons why they burn. But yeah, as we look here, we can kind of see, you know, in January, February, March, obviously there's usually snow on the ground in most of Canada. So yeah, fire doesn't work too well. But, you know, as that snow begins to melt, we really, it opens up the time to burn basically for us. So the time where you can put like really low severity fires on the ground that are low intensity, that are much more easy to control. And then in the summer, we don't burn. Lightning happens, and we also benefit from lightning fires sometime. And then again, that season in the fall where we burn as well. And so lots of benefits. On this picture, it shows like increased berry production, increased nice grass that deer and other ungulates can come in and eat, improves hunting. We use it for ceremonial purposes. So there's a multitude of reasons and a multitude of publications that you can get more information on. So what's basically happened over time, and again, this is another really good Kara Hoffman and team article that shows how biodiversity is really embedded in Indigenous fire or Indigenous stewardship practices on the land. So when we're having like low severity fire events on the land, the top left there, so you can see an interval of returning fire to the land every 0 to 5 years in certain habitats. We see an increase in biodiversity, an increase in heterogeneity, an increase in species composition on the land. And then as well for those medium severity fires, so where we're seeing an interval of higher, and some of these might also be caused by lightning. Again, seeing increases in all those factors. But what we're seeing right now in Canada is the bad fires, right? So we're seeing high severity fires that are occurring at hot, windy, dry times of the year in drought conditions. And with those, we see a decrease in biodiversity, in heterogeneity of the landscape, and in species composition. So again, so that's kind of this background behind good fire and the idea of good fire. And so for me, you know, I write articles about it, but like no one reads them. And so I'm not saying that from like a tenure, you know, like, oh, I need 1 million citations for my CV. My concern has always been that people who would benefit from the information that we're producing through publicly funded science isn't getting to the people that it needs to get to. And so you can see, like I wrote this paper, some of these are like, you know, this one's 13 years old, the top one, and it's only been downloaded 60 times. And like the amount of time that it takes to write these articles, to, you know, do the research behind them, to submit them, to take the reviews back, edit them, redo. It's a lot of work for 60 downloads. And again, this one, just another one that I wrote where you can really see, you know, 442 views, but only 9 citations on it. So again, is this information really getting to where we want it to go? So the inspiration for me was when I attended the Fire Continuum conference in Missoula, Montana, and it was in 2018. And I really was like looking for ways, how can we better share information? So I started thinking about, you know, so I attended a talk basically that was called, it was kind of in a random special session. I don't know how I ended up in it. It was fate maybe, but it was called Podcasts, Social Media, Websites, and Their Role in Knowledge Dissemination. And it was actually done by the creators of the On the Line podcast. And so what they were basically presenting on is how they had the same feeling, like they were doing science for firefighters. So basically, you know, how many squats does a wildland firefighter need to do in a day so that they don't have recurrent knee injuries? You know, it was all that kind of science. And same thing, they were publishing it, but they weren't getting out to the wildland firefighter community. So what they decided to do was try a podcast, something that firefighters could listen to when they were working out, traveling, doing other things. And what they found is just a massive increase in the amount of listeners, like the information that was getting out to people, and then the amount of requests that they were getting back from people for further information. So what really stuck out for me with that was, sorry, I said, there we go. So who are you trying to get your science to, and how do they like to get their information? So for me, that was, we're trying to get our science to Indigenous nations, to communities, to decision makers that will use it. And how do they like to get their information? And you know what? It's not through academic papers. So that really pushed me towards the podcast idea. So I'll pass it to you, Matt.
Yeah, so that speaks pretty highly to how I got into this whole podcasting thing. Actually, I'm a perfect example of how do you like to get your information, right? So I started YourForest back in 2017, I believe, and it was basically just out of a desire to, I was reading papers, I was reading research, I was trying to get this information to help me understand landscape management, forestry, fire, all those types of things. And it's hard to sit down and read a scientific paper and be excited and thrilled, right? It's not built for that. It's built for information, and it's not as charismatic as one might want, right? So for whatever reason, I came around to the idea that I was like, well, I could just talk to these people. So if I could talk to these researchers, talk to these knowledge holders, and get them to explain it in their words, then I can get that information, because that's how I still started. I wanted to learn, and but at the same time, I could share it. So it was basically an excuse to talk to smart people, and it worked out pretty well. So I found it's been very, very helpful in getting information out there, and in developing my kind of balance of understanding of the world, right? So it's been great that way. And yeah, it's just easy to listen to. It's a passive way to get information, right? You can do it while you're driving. You can listen to it in the background while you're washing dishes or whatever. It doesn't require you to set time aside to specifically sit down and read the papers, kind of thing, but you get similar information, right? And it just really helps get the word out. I know in today's day and age, everyone has a podcast. I remember the first time I looked on the Spotify, they have an annual breakdown of where your podcast sits in the world rankings, right? And I sat down and I found out that both YourForest and Good Fire are in the top 1% of podcasts. And first of all, you're like, oh, that's awesome. That's really cool. And then you realize that there must be billions of podcasts, and most of them aren't very good. But but all you need to do is put a little bit of time into it and a little bit of effort into it, and people start to listen. I was actually very surprised at how quickly building a platform like a podcast, if you put the effort in and the care and the passion, people flock to it, and they want to listen, right? So yeah, it's a good way to get that info out there.
Awesome. So I think, why Good Fire as a podcast topic. So, I mean, we're really seeing increasing interest yearly, especially since 2017. And so we put out a Good Fire, I think, in 2019. I had just delivered my daughter when Matt put out the first episode. So I'll always remember what year we started.
Yeah.
That was funny. Anyways, so there was really a lot of repetitive requests from media, from people. So both like government, like bureaucrats, firefighters, Indigenous communities, and there was a massive information hole. There was major academia access barriers. So, there have been some really good articles written in this space, but people weren't finding them, weren't reading them. And then, I thought as well, it could be a really good resource for nations where we share stories. As you know, many Indigenous people are storytellers. That's how our traditions and knowledge get passed along, is often through oral stories. So I thought, a podcast actually worked quite well with that. And so on the right, again, is just a figure from a publication that we did, again, with Kira Hoffman, looking at trends in Google search terms and, the annual area burned in Canada. And so you can just see that it's really been increasing the interest in good fire, the interest in the idea of cultural burning and in controlled fires with the Canadian public. So creating a podcast, wow, this is harder than I thought. So like all good stories, this one actually starts with Dan Thompson, who many of you in the Canada Wildfire community know. So after I attended that Fire Continuum conference, I was sitting in the Northern Forestry Center lunchroom and I said to Dan, yeah, I'm going to create a podcast. And he said to me, oh, that's interesting. And I said, yeah, I'm just going to like talk to my friends and record it. And Dan, bless his heart, said, I think that there's actually a little bit more to podcasting than that. And he said, I actually just was on a podcast with called YourForest and last week. And he said, and it seems a little more like professional than just like, recording your friends on your iPhone. And that, there's a bit more work to it. And so I was actually quite annoyed at the time that Dan obviously capabilities of podcasting. But he said to me, like, I have the guy's name, Matt, and he's like, you should talk to him about what it actually takes to make a podcast. So I sucked my ego aside and contacted Matt with YourForest and asked him and said, I'm thinking of starting this podcast. What does it take? And would you be interested in helping? So yeah, Matt, you can take it from there on what you thought when you got that email.
Yeah. I was pumped. I was really excited because prior to this, like I don't really have any direct connections to the Indigenous world and to helping, but I had already released a bunch of podcasts with some people like Michael Gubbles and a few other folks who were trying to, spread the concept of reconciliation and talk about the need for that type of work in forestry and land management and that kind of thing, and the need for those discussions. But I didn't really have a direct connection. And then Amy reached out with, hey, do you want to do this podcast about good fire? And I'm like, I don't know what the hell good fire is, but I'm in. Let's do that. I was like, I get I'm in. This sounds intriguing, right? Interesting. And so we went and sat down and we talked over the specifics of what it takes to get this out there. And we were off. It was, yeah, I think we merged well pretty quickly, and we both had a similar idea of what we wanted, I think. We're both pretty relaxed. We both kind of wanted to get good information out there, but didn't want it to be a formal setting. And that's how YourForest is as well. It's just conversational. I try to keep it just an open dialogue, see where it goes, right? And that's very much what happened with Good Fire. Yeah, we spent tons of time on the technicals. That was actually my first time contracting myself out as a podcaster. I had funding for YourForest, but putting someone else's idea to light, that was my first time doing it. So we were both in the firsts of this thing. So, but yeah, a lot of time on microphones. Amy she's like, yeah, I can just record it with my phone. It should be good. I'm like, absolutely not. That's a terrible idea. If you want people to listen, we need to do better than that. And yeah, and we were off from there. It was it's been a cool time. We spent a lot of time trying to figure out guests. Amy said she wants to talk to people from Australia, from South America. I'm like, okay, time zones is going to be a thing. Yeah, it was a lot of fun though. I enjoyed every second of it.
Awesome. So yeah, you mentioned there, Matt, that like podcasts aren't free. I thought they were when I started. I mean, if you volunteer a lot of your own personal time and have your own equipment and things, then yeah, maybe they can be. But for us, it wasn't free. So, for me, a huge concern, because at that time I was a public servant, like with the Canadian Forest Service, and I could have very easily done the podcast like with my job. But I had a ton of concerns around intellectual property, especially because we were telling Indigenous people's stories and inviting Indigenous people to come on the podcast. And anything really produced by the government of Canada always has that, thing on it belongs to, at that time it was the Queen, but now the King. And and then also it would be being used by them as like, oh, look at what we're doing with Indigenous communities. And I wasn't sure that I wanted the Good Fire podcast to be that kind of platform for them. So I actually reached out at that time to Canada Wildfire, and there was the great team there that said, like led by Mike Flanagan, that said, yeah, this is something actually we're thinking of getting into as well. We see the future for it, and it'd be great to start with this. So, I mean, we started low. I think it was a few $1,000s a year for the first season, and has increased just because of equipment demands on Matt's time, honoraria for guests, providing guests with equipment. So like we said, it's I guess kind of cheap in the relative scale of fire science and how much that can cost, but it still does come with a price.
Yeah, a lot of the price is just time, right? I think a lot of folks think that it's, yeah, I'll just sit down with my friend, I'll record a conversation, we'll put it out there, and you can do that. But that's the other 99% of the podcast that I was talking about. That you know what I mean? Like, so there's if you want to do it properly, it takes just like a little bit of effort, right? A little bit of time. Oh, you lost the screen there, Amy.
Weird. Okay.
I'll keep
Okay.
talking. But yeah, basically it's time. I was blown away when I first started podcasting how much time it was going to take. I had this crazy idea in my mind that I would pump out an episode every week, and that was very quickly shattered. I went down to one every 2 weeks, and then 18 a year, and now I'm down to 12 a year is what I do for YourForest. That's all I have the time for, because it is not something I do during my day job, right? I do it on my free time, which is also part of the issue. But yeah, that's most of the money. But also there's a lot of other things that cost money. Like you need a recording space. So if you're going to record remotely, you need a place to go, and the good ones cost a little bit of money. You can do it over Zoom, you could do it over Teams. It's not great. I don't recommend it. Super don't do that. These other two that are listed here. And if I don't want to get crazy into the details of the technicals, but if anybody wants more information about the technicals, I can send you more of that. Just shoot me an email, yourforestpodcast@gmail.com, and I can send you the specifics. I don't want to glass anybody's eyes over, even though I can't see them. But the main thing is Zencastr and Riverside, those are both platforms you can use to record a podcast that are great. The reason being is that you will not lose your data. So as soon as you start recording, it's downloading a backup to your computer. So even if you lose internet, or your computer explodes, that recording still exists, which I can tell you is a real pain if you lose a recording. And then there's some more places. You have to have a place to host it, right? So a website, and you have to connect that website to all the platforms, which is not that bad. It's okay. It's a lot easier now than when I started. Now you can pay for that. There's websites that'll do that. There's podcast hosting platforms, and then editing software. I am not by any means an audio technician or anything like that. I learned just enough to get me by. That's literally all I know. If I sit down with someone who knows audio, I'm going to get lost, and my eyes are going to glaze over. But there's some free ones out there. I used Audacity, and it can get you in the door. And same thing, if people want to start this, I can give them the basic things I use in editing to get things done that are relatively simple once you dive into it. Yeah, but the other thing is metrics. So if you're going to put something out there, you want to know who's listening, right? You have to tag that. There's some technicals behind it, but it's not as simple as putting it out there and you get like a report saying, oh, this is what happened, this is who listened, this is where they were. You actually have to specifically ask for that and tag it somewhere. And the platforms, luckily those podcast hosting platforms will do a lot of that for you now. But yeah, if you want it, you have to do the research and spend the time getting into it. And it's totally worth it in the end. Okay, audio. This was something, like I said before with Amy, when our first meeting, right? It was like, how do we record this? And audio is everything. I don't know if a lot of people now listen to podcasts in their headphones, so they can hear every little crack, every sniffle, for me, it's the nose whistle. I have to edit so much because my nose whistles when I talk sometimes, and it is so terribly annoying. But the good audio picks that up, but you can edit it out. But the bad audio is even worse because it just crackles and it's got so much background noise. Don't use, like, right now I'm using my laptop microphone. That's because my good audio mics they have problems with Zoom and stuff like that. They come in really low, really quiet. So I just use this for now. But I definitely recommend, if you're going to record something, buy a couple mics. Like I have this one. This is the first one I bought. It's just it's like a $80 microphone, dynamic microphone. Makes all the world of difference. And you have really clear sounding stuff right away.
And separate tracks?
Oh, right. Sorry. Yeah. 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 No, it's separate tracks as well. Yeah, if you're going to record, having separate tracks is key. So that's part of the problem with recording on your phone or recording on Zoom. Zoom has everybody's merged in together. It's just one recording that you get. So if my audio was quiet or sounded weird or there was banging in the background, I can't do anything about that if it's all one. So the main thing is you want every speaker to have their own tracks. You can manually edit them. Otherwise, it can be very, very challenging to do. So I know, like, for example, just to emphasize the importance of audio quality, I've abandoned so many podcasts that I've listened to because there was just something annoying about the audio. And yeah, it's just really, really, it's something that a lot of people glaze over, and a lot of good podcasts have poor audio, weirdly enough. But they never quite break through and get like a loyal following because it's just annoying to listen to. All right. You go to the next one, Amy.
Yeah, I did change it, but I don't see it changing here.
Okay, there, it changed. It just changed. You're good.
Can you see it or no?
Yeah. Yeah, yeah, I can see it. Yeah, you're good.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so recording Good Fire season 1. I mean, the thing with this, is it's always great and fun to record podcasts and the idea of it. And I think I was lucky because I had a really extensive network that I could kind of reach out to do these things. But we encountered a lot of issues in Good Fire season 1. And so just a reminder to everyone, this was like before COVID, before really the emergence of Zoom and other platforms and what we're doing right now, where we're like talking and videoing. A lot of stuff then was still done by the old-fashioned telephone. And so it was just a different time. And because of that, we had a lot of issues. So again, I'm pressing, but I don't see things coming up, but I'll just give it a second. So I'll just talk through them. So one thing was like scheduling, and it was time zones, right? It was really difficult because I wanted to talk to people in different places. And so that was one thing that was really an issue with trying to schedule times. And then, having bad internet connections. We had tons of issues with that, trying to get things. We had question list, I missed that one. So there was also like different styles, right? For Matt and I, for me, like I knew everyone we were interviewing. I'm obviously in this talk, so my thing was just, I said to Matt, he's like, well, okay, what are we going to talk about? And I'm like, oh, we'll just like wing it, like as the episode goes. Like I kind of know the theme and what this person's working on. But Matt, because it was so different than the YourForest podcast, was like, because wasn't as integrated basically into the subject. So yeah, I think it was a little bit more uncomfortable for Matt. I don't know if you want to share more on that, Matt.
Yeah, well, it was just, I think, Your Forest is so broad, it covers so many different things that I spend a lot of time researching every topic and coming up with like a list of questions mainly. Basically, not because I'm going to go off each question one for one, but I want to have my mind straight about, I don't want to miss anything. I want to make sure to squeeze every drop of juice out of that lemon and make sure that everybody listening gets everything they can out of the person that I'm talking to. And so, because I don't normally know a lot about the topics I'm talking about, I do a lot of research. So for Amy, obviously this is her whole world, right? And so it took me a minute to get used to the idea of just going in kind of open-minded and doe-eyed and just kind of listen and see what comes up. And I think part of the reason that, and correct me if I'm wrong, Amy, but part of the reason that she had me on as a co-host, I think, was, well, first of all, to help guide the podcasting situation and make sure that the structure was good. But I think also because I didn't know a lot about fire, I had fought fire. I did a few years of hack, and I'm a forester, so I know about fire, but it's not my whole world, right? And I knew nothing about cultural burning. So I think part of the reason that I was there was to be that person that didn't know what was up, right? That was kind of the idea. Someone who knows a little bit, but also has some genuine questions from a non-Indigenous person perspective. Yeah, and so that was good. I mean, it was awesome for me. It allowed me a
Yeah,
chance.
I didn't want to. Sorry, Matt.
I know we got weird we got we got a little bit of a delay, but yeah. Go ahead, Amy. Go ahead.
Yeah, I just didn't want it to be like that expert type thing, where it was like a bunch of people sitting in a room that really knew the topic, and then other listeners, because it's supposed to be educational, right? And so even sometimes, we have discussions where you say to me like, oh, I don't like, what does that mean? Like Indigenous erasure or other things like that in fight.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So it's good to have somebody there that can say that. So the other thing we had an issue as we're having now with internet connections, it was even worse back then. And because many of the people that we interview are also Indigenous from communities that might not have as good of service, it was even more of an issue. And then microphones. So we spoke about microphones for ourselves, but it was also the issue of microphones for guests, right? How was their audio? And we had a lot of issues with that. And so one example is the dreaded WhatsApp recording. So this was actually, I think, on season 2, but the with Guyana. So we had someone from there who drove like 6 hours to be interviewed for the podcast, and the connection kept dropping. So what ended up happening with some of that episode was actually recorded through WhatsApp. So I would just send them a question, and then they would respond on WhatsApp. And poor Matt then had to stitch all of that together and make it actually sound coherent. But you can hear, like, in the different podcast episodes, on the ones where we did have problems. And another thing for us is that every guest that we have on our podcast, they review their episode before it goes live. And that takes a lot of time to be able to do that. Like people will come back to us and say, can you move this, or I want to add this, or please delete this. There's also lots of this information we're discussing is sensitive, right? So there's parts where we just edit it out complete sections because we're like, this shouldn't be publicly shared. So all of that really takes time. Yeah, so sharing, Matt, if you want to talk about it.
Yeah, sure. No, I can do that. So there's lots of ways to share podcasts. You can pay, right? You can pay for advertisements and stuff like that. They're pretty expensive, but I think they are very useful. You can do that through Spotify. You can do, paid ads through social media and stuff like that. I found the paid ads through social media less helpful, so I wouldn't recommend that. But if you do want to start something and do it through, I'd say Spotify ads are really good for that. But I don't do that, mostly because I just don't have the money for it. But I think a Twitter, LinkedIn, Instagram, all those social media platforms can be really helpful. And basically just putting something out there as often as you can, right? I don't personally like social media. I think there's a huge value to it, but I don't like being on it. It stresses me out. But I found it's really, really helpful in getting the word out there and spreading the podcast. So what I've started doing now, there's a few apps that allow you to make little videos. So we don't record video, we just record audio. And there's one app called Headliner, and it allows you to just take a clip of audio and create a little video and punch it out. And so it takes me 5 minutes to make a 1-minute clip of a teaser from one of our episodes. I put it on social media with something fun. I'll make 9 or 10 of those for an episode, and I'll release that, kind of once a day or once every other day after an episode's been released. And I find that really helps when people can just hear a teaser of it. just kind of get a feel for what's going on, they're much more likely to click that link and check it out. So that's been really helpful. A lot of it was word of mouth, but I think social media is probably your biggest and best option. And the more active you are on there, the more you're going to get, the more people are going to get.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. I'm a very poor self-promoter. So I think that's one of my regrets with Good Fire, is that I haven't been more active or had more time to really share it.
It's the time
So
though. That's the problem. It's the time, right? Like it's you work a full-time job and then you have kids and you have family and like how much time do you have? And that's the thing. And we'll get into that, how much time it takes to record and promote an episode. But yeah, it's a lot more than you think, for sure.
yeah, so in terms of promotion, what really helped us was ologies. And so that was when the Good Fire podcast really took off. So this is like kind of a funny story, because I was literally on holidays in the shoe shop. At that time, BC was burning down. And I got an email from Matt saying, because I don't have very good internet there. So I got an email from Matt saying, like, oh my goodness, Ologies has reached out. You have to do this podcast. And I actually admit that I had no idea what Ologies even was. And so Matt was like, it's the #1 science podcast. Like, you need to get on it and do the podcast. It's a great place for you to share like the science that you're doing. So I ended up doing the interview from my basement, or my parents' cabin's basement, on holidays. The internet was horrible. It kept dropping. They had technical issues on their side. My kids were running around and screaming. But that's the beauty of the edit, right? Is that like they can then put that together. And then we were actually evacuated from a fire at a few days later. And so, it kind of, I guess, wove or told kind of a good story about the real risk to people that we have in Canada with fire. And so that was anyways when we really kind of, through their promotion, their huge network that they have, when people really started listening.
You know what I found
So
really,
then,
really nice to realize though, because I feel like Amy and I had a lot of um, kind of imposter syndrome when it came to being podcasters and promoting content like that. We're kind of like, who the heck are we, right? So when the #1 science podcast reached out to us, they're like, hey, Matthew, we really want to have Amy on. We have an episode going out in 4 days. And I'm like, what are you 4
yeah,
days? And I'm like,
yeah.
we take like a month or more to get an episode out. And I'm like, okay, I guess we got our stuff together a lot more than we thought. So it's so you do fly by the seat of your pants a little bit when the opportunities arise, right?
Yeah, my one thing that made me happy about being on it was how many technical difficulties they had. And I was like,
Yeah,
wow, it's us. Like, they couldn't get their microphones to work.
it's
All
always
these,
something.
yeah, made me feel a bit better. So
Me
then we
too.
went planning and recording Good Fire season 2. And so that one, again, as I said, it was a bit different because it was post like the lockdowns and other things, post the like working from home. So people really started to, get video online conferencing. Zencaster at that time added then like a video component, so you could see the people that you were talking to, which made it easier, like not to interrupt and kind of have better conversation flow. Yeah, so season 2 as well was really good. And in that one too, we really tried to get more diverse voices. So we have an episode like from Guyana, from Africa, from other places, besides just kind of the top 3, which is usually Canada, Australia, US, where most of the fire science info comes out of. So then another big thing from the podcast has been these requests to share. And again, not sharing this to show like, ooh, look where every place Good Fire is. But for me, the important lesson of this is like, just because you have a podcast, it doesn't stop at that, right? Because you've put that content out into the world, other people then can pick it up and use it for education and kind of build their own education pieces around it. So we've been featured in like a bunch of different places. With multiple university courses, I've had profs reach out to me and say, like, can I share a certain episode as part of the background material for my course, which has been awesome. Media as well. We get a lot of different media folks that listen to the podcast. And for me, what's nice is it gives people a bit of a background on the topic, so that I'm not kind of always fielding like really general information requests. I can just say, like, go listen to some episodes of the Good Fire podcast first.
All right, this is me, right? Okay.
Yep.
So yeah, metrics. So I'm trying to remember if we always had metrics for Good Fire, if it started halfway through. I think we always had it. So throughout the 23 episodes, this is as of October, last October, so it's probably a little bit more now. We had over 50,000 downloads for all those episodes. So the best episode we had, I forget which one it was, but 4,500 downloads. And then the least we had was 1,200. And if I had to guess, the least downloaded one probably was one of the ones with bad audio, if I had to guess.
Yeah.
But yeah, on average, about 2,200 people or 2,200 downloads, I should say. But there's also other ones, like there's streams that people can listen to as well. But I think the majority of it comes through the downloads. And so that's really good. Like that's really, really good for an episode. Like for example, Your Forest has been going on for a little bit longer than Good Fire, and I have like 146 episodes, and I average about the same. I average about 2,000, 3,000 an episode, and so Good Fire really, really early on grabbed on to a certain chunk of the population, and they held on tight because it's this my show. If I stop releasing episodes, it just kind of dwindles off. You stop seeing steady listenership. Good Fire doesn't. Even throughout, we have a year and a half off of nothing released, or 2 years off with nothing released, and there's still steady listenership. Obviously, we get the most of it when a new episode comes out, but there's still steady listenership. There's always some activity going on there, and I think that speaks to the huge importance and desire to understand of these concepts of cultural burning and wanting to be an ally and that kind of thing, because it's pretty incredible. All right. So when we found out we were doing this, I just kind of sat down one tired evening and I started writing out bullet points about things that are about podcasting. And this is what happened. So we'll go through it quick. Number one, honestly, to start a podcast, you have to really want this, right? You have to really have some kind of insatiable passion, some kind of topic that you really want to push out there, and you're willing to work for it and you're willing to sacrifice for it, because like I said, we're going to get into it really soon. It takes a lot of work, and if you don't have that passion, it's going to probably fall apart or just not go anywhere. And I'm not saying that anyone's going to become famous this way. That's not what this is for, but it does help get information out. And the other thing was a willingness to learn, right? So I found, especially through Good Fire, I was a student. I was just sitting there listening, learning. Like Good Fire was for me, it was the first time I was put into a situation where I was completely outside of my own culture, right? So like everybody at the table was talking from a non Western perspective, right? They're talking about the Indigenous perspective and Indigenous ideas and a culture that was completely not my own. And so it took me a long time to just understand that and to try and put things together and to not ask questions from my own perspective that were irrelevant, right? So I learned a lot through Good Fire for that point. It really helped me understand that there's a lot more going on out there than our own ways of knowing, right? And so it's important to just go in there with humility and willing to learn. I think actually one thing I really heard from, I forget who it was, but they said one of the most interesting things to listen to is somebody that's learning, right? So if you actually hear somebody have an epiphany moment during a podcast and go, oh, I understand, that all of a sudden it helps you feel like part of the process. And it's so much more impactful than just listening to someone's felt facts. So it is good to just go in there ready to learn and change your opinion. And yeah, dedication to truth, just wanting to make sure that you're objective, basically. I try to strive for that through Your Forest. I try not to pick any one perspective. I try to stay in the middle and objective and just let things be what they are. Go to the next one. Good audio. We talked about that, so I won't beat that horse to death anymore. Good audio. Consistency. One thing about releasing content is you want to be consistent. So you want to So we recorded the whole season before we released it. So all 10 episodes were recorded and ready to go before we started releasing it, because we didn't want to have any huge breaks in the middle. So that's important. People want to know when the content's coming out. You think about your favorite TV show that's being released on a weekly basis, right? If you miss a week or two, you're going to be pissed. So you want to make sure that that stuff's coming out. You keep people interested, right? Intriguing brand, that's just a way of saying cool, right? Something that looks cool and is fun and is people want to be a part of it, right? And then yeah, willingness to work. It's like I said, it sounds like you can just sit down, record a conversation, release it. Not quite that simple. Patience. Amy talked about that a little bit. The number of times we've had to reschedule multiple times, or we've met with somebody and had to reschedule because of their audio, or we've had times where we were planning to record with people, and then something happened. I think there was one when there was literally an evacuation or something, or there was some major fire event happening that shut us down. And then editing. So for context, the amount of time that goes into this, I have a little bit of a better idea for YourForest because I keep a log for that. But for me to put out a 1 hour episode, it can be anywhere from 8 to 30 hours of work for me. 30 hours is on the high end. That's if I'm doing a bunch of research and a lot of editing on the back end. But I would say plan for 8 hours for every hour you put out. That's pretty reasonable, I think, because just think about Amy spends hours trying to get guests, just emailing back and forth and organizing timelines. That's hours there. A couple hours for the recording, because there's always technical issues, and then hours in the back end doing editing and then promoting. It adds up. Yeah. And transparency. I think just going in there, not trying to put on a mask or a face, just being earnestly curious is huge. Just going out there and letting things be what they are is a really big deal. People can tell when they're being sold a crock of garbage, right? Like they know when they're being sold something. So it's important to come out as genuine as possible and just be transparent with the information, and that really helps, I think, with people wanting to come back and interested in what you have putting out there. So
yeah, these are some of the reviews I would say that are also helpful when people come through. I will, full disclosure, admit the one on the far right, CBabs10, that's my little brother. And so the day we released the podcast, I told him, go on there and give us a 5-star review. It does help, get your metrics higher too for people to basically show up in their feed. And then, this is my 11th to add to Matt's list, is the colleagues who are amazing storytellers who trust you. So these are all the voices that we've had on Good Fire, season 1 and season 2, and more to come, obviously with this next season coming up. So yeah, and especially the top line of folks, those were the ones who really, before Good Fire was anything, I was just I'm doing a podcast. Can you please be a guest? And they had no idea what they were getting into and if it would be a complete waste of their time. But, we're willing to sit down and have that chat. And what I will say, too, is that for guests as well, it is a good place for them to come and sit and talk. And they get a produced episode on what they're doing. And I've heard lots of them now share their own podcasts with different people for, background on them as well. So it becomes kind of a win-win over time. And then, so this is Good Fire season 3. And as we said, we're going into the matriarch season. So one thing when I look at that past list is that, there's a lot of male faces, to be 100% honest. And that is what the fire world is. And it's the same in Indigenous fire and Good Fire. And so I really want to basically, Good Fire is all about matriarchs, right? In many communities, and many women were the ones who decided when and where to burn. And so I really want to feature Indigenous voices. And so we've recorded a few episodes. I've already had multiple scheduling and cancellation conflicts and things, not conflicts in a bad way, just, life happens. And so we're trying desperately to record and get the episode out. And so we do have a little clip. I'm going to just click on it to play, Matt, and just give me a thumbs up if you can hear it. And if not, we'll just move to the next slide.
You know what? They're never probably going to accept you, but don't stop being the way you are, you know, like don't. And that did kind of make me feel better. But then when I was at the Crook Indigenous Women's Treks, like I felt like I was able to step into the role as a leader when I had support. So so that was huge. Point, yeah. So you made a huge difference, Vicki, like with what you guys did there, like just with helping a lot of us realize that we are leaders. It was actually the environment we were in that was trying to hold us back.
Perfect. Yeah. So I will say already there's lots of tears and other things shed, like with some very honest storytellers. And I think it's going to be a really amazing season.
You know what? They're never probably going to.
Okay. So, yeah, just to conclude, we wanted to point to some other really great fire podcasts that we've heard about, been part of, listened to. And so one is like listening to Fire Knowledges, which is about fire in the Okanagan Valley with a feature on good fire and traditional knowledge. Intentional Fire, which is by Vicki Preston, who's with the Crook tribe in California. And that one's a really focused look at their nation and their relationship with fire. There's World on Fire, which is another Canada Wildfire funded podcast series that is as well great, really high production value on that one. The Life with Fire podcast, which is Amanda Monteith, who does an amazing job interviewing all sorts of people about fire. And then the Anchor Point podcast, which is much more of a firefighter focused podcast, but again, very interesting content there. So yeah, I think that's it from us. So I will stop sharing my screen if I can find my thing here. Sorry, I had to share it awkwardly so you can see the audio. Stop share here. Okay, there we go. I think we're back.
Thanks, Amy and Matthew. That was really, really interesting. I feel like when you talked about the inception of Good Fire and we talked about searching for sponsorship and how when you came to Canada Wildfire, we were like, oh, it's something we want to get into. And we haven't yet. And I think you showed a lot of how much work it really is. And we've had these pipe dreams at the beginning of being able to do a podcast. And I think we went through a lot of the same process of like, oh, we'll just sit down and interview people and we'll throw it together and it'll be nothing. And then we started to actually think and write stuff down and realized, you know, we don't necessarily have the resources and especially the time to be able to do this well. So amazing work on both of your behalf to be able to pull this together, especially looking at the diversity of the people you're bringing in geographically on top of everything else. It's a huge feat. And I'd really like to say that when you were sharing, you know, your top 10 plus 11 things, number 10 really hit me. So transparency. And I think that a lot of the reason why you see that continued viewership, this is just my opinion, with Good Fire is not just transparency, but it's authenticity. And that people are coming there and it's real and it's connectable and it just hits different, right? So I hope that always stays there. I hope that it always remains, and I think it will. I think it's so important to both of you. If anyone has questions, comments, you can post them in the chat. We are recording. If you are comfortable and want to unmute and put on your camera, you are also welcome to do that. I don't see any yet. Oh, here we go. So the first question, I'm going to guess this one will go to you, Matthew, is what is the best platform where we can all communicate and share news on this topic?
News on the topic. That's a good question. Yeah, like I'm almost thinking about depends, right? Like, so social media I find it depends, right? Like if you want this to be out there for the public to see, then I think any social media works, right? Like Twitter I find is really good for academic stuff. I feel like there's a lot of academic conversations going on there. LinkedIn is, I find, surprisingly helpful for that kind of stuff. But yeah, as far as like you know, like a more private place, more private platform, closed door to try and do that. I'm not sure that there really is one, right? But yeah, it's an interesting point.
Yeah, I think the one thing I wish that we had in Canada, I know Canada Wildfire is looking at it in others, is, you know, in the States, they have the fire knowledge exchange groups. So kind of for each region, and there's a website, you know, there's lots of different ways that people can share. They do presentations, podcasts, like newsletters, all sorts of things to get info out. And I do think that that's a really good model. I wish that we had something similar in Canada that was as active as those groups there. But again, to be determined kind of where that goes.
Thanks, Amy and Matthew. And I guess it kind of, sorry, I'm scribbling notes. The big question that also comes up as a follow-up to this is, you know, what kind of longevity are you looking for those conversations? Do either of you have any feelings about Reddit lives? You know, when we bring in an expert and you have kind of that live time limited conversation versus having something shared permanently through LinkedIn. Do you have any insights onto that?
I haven't really, you know, I wasn't even aware that that was a thing, honestly. So that's news to me. So no, I can't say I do, but I think, yeah, I think there's probably, I think they all have merit, right? Like I think there's an opportunity for Reddit's really good for that, right? Creating the subreddits and having very specific topics, and only people that are very into it are there. So I find Reddit, yeah, Reddit would be a fantastic place to do that. If someone, I don't know if there is a cultural burning subreddit or a good fire subreddit, but that would be a good idea actually, now that you say that. Yeah.
Yeah, I did once a Twitter live event that was during one of the fire seasons, and the idea from that is I can't remember what group it was, but they had like in kind of an expert a day that would come in for an hour and just like field questions under a certain hashtag. And I did think that that was really good. It was limited, unfortunately, though, by the time, like the, you know, Twitter basically, and that the limit on, you know, the number of characters and like how much can you really convey in a tweet. And also when you're being kind of asked on the spot all sorts of different random questions. And then too, it was difficult because a lot of operational questions come in, right? Like, you know, where are the firefighters? Why is no one doing this? What's happening here? And so you can't really answer those. And then it also feels like it's frustrating for people because they just want that information. So yeah, I think that there's different platforms. What I would say is that like everybody consumes information different ways. And so that's the big thing for me is making sure that we're available on lots of different types of platforms and ways. Like some people love academic articles, some people love books, right? So yeah, it's making sure that you're basically have information available in different ways for people to consume as they see fit.
Thank you. We did get a question in the chat. I'm going to sneak one in before. And my question would be, do you find that there's benefit, or do either of you send out questions ahead of time to the people that you're interviewing? You just mentioned how it's hard when you're getting kind of questions on the fly. Is that a useful tactic to send out questions in advance?
Yeah, I have to admit, so podcasts that I've been a guest on, they have done that, or at least sent themes. And I really do appreciate that. So at least kind of I know, and especially for me as like currently working in the public service, it does help me to know too, will things be in the wheelhouse of what I can answer? Because, you know, I don't want to be just having to kind of defer everything and say I can't answer. For good fire, we do not do that, although it probably is a best practice. So yeah, so usually what happens is that honestly, I just know the people that we interview and their work. And so I just say to them, like, yeah, I want to talk to you about like the work that you're doing in such and such. And then they just come on, and most are amazing, like speakers on their own, like Byami Williamson, for example. Like we just said to him, we want to chat with you about emergency management and how for Indigenous peoples are constantly excluded. And that was, you know, we pretty much ran a whole conversation from that. So yeah, I think that there's different ways to do it. But again, it's that whole thing of that for me and the other people we're interviewing, it's on such a specific topic that we're familiar with. But honestly, it makes Matt uncomfortable all the time. So poor Matt.
My other show, like I said, it's more broad. And so a lot of times I'll send them, I may not send questions unless they specifically ask. If they ask, for sure, 100%, I'll come up with some, but I always tell them that, just so you know, like this is where my head's at, this is what I'm thinking. We might stray, right? I think, but I always send them a very specific concept. I'm like, this is the concept that I would like to discuss today. So at least they know, okay, we're talking about this, and we may step outside slightly, but this is the goal. So yeah, definitely more information. I think it's pretty hard to just reach out to somebody. If someone just reached out to me, be like, hey, I want to record something with you, and that was all the information I had, I would have a hard time saying yes. So yeah, you definitely want more details than that. And yeah, I generally only offer up the actual questions if they specifically ask for them. And that's not because I don't want to share them. It's more just I think I want them to come thinking about it and have it be an active process of processing that question. Because I feel like sometimes you can prepare a question and it doesn't come out as genuine as you might want it to be. But yeah, it's up to the person. I make sure everyone, my number one goal is to make sure everyone that's on either of these shows is comfortable and happy with the result, right? So I'm not going to put out anything that someone is uncomfortable with or unsure about. So
yeah, I think too, I was just going to add quickly that we want it to seem like a natural conversation, right? And I think when you give question lists, you really run into that, just like question, answer, and the conversation, and people don't like listening to it as much because it's, like you said, not authentic. And there's been things I wanted to talk to people on Good Fire about, but we've totally got off topic because I'm like, they bring up something else that I'm like, oh, that's actually what we should get into. That's like way more interesting. So yeah, I think it's just being flexible. And yeah, I think that's what gives it that authentic feel there. Because we're just trying, but then again, that's also that I have relationships with most of these people before, so that does help a lot too.
That speaks a lot to the question. We mentioned, I'll just read it out. You mentioned some of this briefly, but how do you prepare for episodes to maintain an approachable tone while still creating a cohesive structure? And I think that speaks to that, right? Like for Amy, I think because she knows these people and this is her wheelhouse, it was naturally comfortable. For me, a lot of times for Good Fire, it was just trying to be still and just kind of be there and write down questions as they come. But for my other show, again, the reason that I can be able to be a little bit more unapproachable feel to it is because I go prepared, right? So I do so much research that I can be in the moment when I'm actually recording. I think if you're trying to read off a question list as you're recording, it's going to come off as a canned answer, canned response kind of thing, right? Like it's going to go backward like that. So I think the answer to that question would be just go in so prepared that you can just wing that conversation. You can go through it, and it will be, because it'll be genuine. It'll be authentic because you're prepared and you're excited to ask these questions, and they're in your head. And for me, the list is more of just a reminder, like, oh yeah, that one, and just kind of a bullet point thing, right? So that's how I would say you can record something and be a little more approachable. Is just have a clear idea what you want to talk about. And prepare so much that you're not going to stray and you're not going to be stressing and overthinking it. I guess that's kind of where I would go with that.
Yeah, the beauty of Good Fire too, sorry, just quickly, is that it's also like for Indigenous knowledge and other things, like it's not just about a topic that we're an expert in. It's like, it's not about what we do, but about who we are, right? And so I think that really comes across in the podcast too, and makes the conversations flow easily and makes people interested because it's so interwoven with like our personal lives. And you'll see that in the matriarch season coming up, like the episodes we've recorded, like there's no split between like, this technical expertise or whatever we call it side of Good Fire, and then the person and their family and their kids and their elders and their community work. So yeah, it just makes it, I think we're almost lucky with the topic that we have for this podcast, because it's really fun and easy to talk about.
Thanks. I was going to say it, both of you use very similar terminology from opposite perspectives. So you're both like, we need to be able to wing it and be comfortable. And Amy, this is, you're so focused, and rightfully so, on relationships and people and community and a way of life and comfort being important so you can wing it. And Matt, you're researching so that you can understand and be prepared. But the most important thing, I think, is you're meeting in the middle where you're comfortable. And I think that probably translates to the entire session becoming comfortable, which is kind of neat that you can come from almost two polar opposite angles at one target and get such a similar result. I did have okay, I'm just reading here. There is a question just popped in. Beyond numbers of downloads, do you have any tips about how to think about, measure, or communicate the impact of the podcast?
I was going to ask a question that ties into this, and it's something that comes up every once in a while during episodes with Good Fire. And I was asking Amy, like, how have you noticed movement on, the Good Fire front, and there being able to be more Indigenous cultural burning and, changing of the system so that we're opening things up and becoming more, more new age, less colonialist in our mindsets when it comes to fire management?
Yeah, so I would say, like, for the question too, like in terms of metrics, like I don't know if we can include my emails in that, but like that's what I was naive about, is just when you're putting something out there that suddenly like you're opening yourself up to people. And so especially during Good Fire season 1, I just got an explosion of emails, like, and a lot from non-Indigenous people saying like, oh, I totally support this. I really want to understand your ways. Like, how do I meet an elder? And so then in season 2, we really tried to correct that with putting out things on like, allies, how important that is. Even in season 3, we have an episode on like how you can be a good accomplice in Good Fire, and, how other people are doing really good work and not overstepping Indigenous peoples. And so for me, that was one thing that I didn't expect, was just the amount of emails and requests from people. And so I think in terms of the movement on Good Fire, like it's going to sound like dramatic, but I feel like there's like a wave or like tsunami of, movement behind this now. There's all sorts of groups forming, national, local groups, and especially in the US and Australia, pushing this forward. But I still feel like that we're all hitting up against a massive wall, which is basically like systemic racism in wildfire management, and colonial laws and barriers that are keeping us from fire. And I think we're starting to see like trickles, like in California with the new legislation, all about who's a cultural burner, who's able to burn. We have a whole episode of Don Hankins on that. But they're still running up against these issues with trying to actually get Good Fire on the ground. Australia is another good example. Like Fire Sticks now, they're working with training and certifying cultural burners. Like that's always been a major issue for us, is, how do you know that people have the knowledge to carry this out? But I still feel like there's that massive wall, and it gets so frustrating because every season we kind of go through it again and again. And I have like a ton of ecologic grief, like personally, especially last year when my family's traditional territory was heavily impacted by the fires. And, why is no one listening? But I feel like, that momentum's keeping going. And I'm part of a lot of really good projects now that are really getting into legislation. And I should have been a lawyer because I'm any of it, but I'm trying to learn. So yeah, I think that's where we are right now with Good Fire. But I do think that the podcast has helped with that, and especially with like universities, because there's a lot of students listening to episodes of Good Fire now, that is hopefully changing their perception as they move out into their fields of work.
Thanks for that, Amy. We do have a question in the chat, but before, it's kind of changing topics. I had kind of a technical question and also a sensitive question. So I was curious to know from your perspectives if there are significant editing differences or time post recording between Good Fire and YourForest. Just because of the nature of the topics of Good Fire, they can often be sensitive. Amy, you alluded to that not everything that's said needs to be shared with the public, or should be. Like it's personal, it's traditional. And I was curious if you found a difference in the amount of post-process editing kind of due to that nature, or if it's not anything significant.
Yeah, I think the honest answer is early on, I didn't do a lot of content editing. I did a lot of quality editing. I didn't do a lot of content editing on either show, mostly time constraint. And because I wasn't sure what I could remove without bastardizing the information, right? Like and Good Fire was especially that, because it's not my story, because it's not my culture, because I'm not entirely sure what's important and what's not. I was very tentative to remove any kind of content, unless it was, a tangent about the weather or the dog just crapped on the carpet or something, which happens sometimes.
I don't remember that.
I remember something like that. There was a cat or a dog, I don't remember, but there's little life things. The kid runs in, that stuff gets pulled out. But I think no. Now no. I say the first season, yes, there was a lot. I was very much not content editing really anything, because I didn't want to overstep. And then when our guests reviewed it, they told us what they wanted to keep or get rid of, and then I would do it, right? Now I think I'm a little bit more comfortable, and I'm not removing anything unless it's like repetitive, or a lot of what I removed, like for example, the first episode, I was telling Amy, so her and two of her friends were talking about all this stuff, and it's an incredible episode, so vulnerable, a lot going on. It was just such a powerful episode, the first episode of season 3, and all I had to remove was a lot of likes and ums, because they were so comfortable, they were so themselves. It was like they were sitting around having a beer, just and I was okay, I gotta so I removed a lot of that, but I didn't have to remove the content because it just flowed so nicely. But I think YourForest has a lot more content editing, because it's less personal, it's more science based, it's more research based, it's less about the culture and more about the actual, like the science and the research and that kind of thing. It's easier for me to pull stuff out and be like, that's not, we don't need that. That's not important. But for Good Fire, it's so personal that it's really hard for me to be like, well, that very personal and touching story doesn't count. Like that's a pretty bold thing for me to do. So yes, I don't do nearly as much.
Yeah, we're always super careful too, because like we've had elders on the show, we always give them honoraria, like make sure that they know exactly what's happening, get written permission of that their story is going to be shared. I give like tobacco, other proper protocol. So yeah, there's all those things kind of too that we follow with Good Fire, and then to the content editing and letting them be able as well to do it, because we want the episodes to be a positive experience for people, and not that they feel like they're getting kind of knowledge taken and shared that they're not comfortable with or haven't agreed to do that.
I think that's it's so special that you've made, like, I'm going to say informed consent, but also informed decision making of what they're willing to share and not share, such an important part of the process. And I'm sure it is very much appreciated. There was a question that came into the chat. I'm guessing this is kind of taking a step back from Good Fire as the podcast and looking at Good Fire on the land. So is there a general methodology for Good Fire to prevent becoming dangerous?
Yeah, so I think that the whole thing of that is to do with Indigenous like knowledge and lived experience on the land, and just knowing when is a good and not a good time to burn. And so I actually don't really know of like true cultural burns that are being done by Indigenous knowledge holders that get out of control. Like for me on my property, when we burn, like I don't feel any risk whatsoever because of the time when we're burning. And so that's very different from the Western sense, where a lot of times when you're burning, like, we talk about, you want it all black or that kind of thing. Whereas this, like, it's okay if you get a patchy burn. It doesn't really matter. Like, a lot of times when I'm burning, there's still water everywhere. There's lots of guards and natural things like lots of natural breaks on the landscape. My worry is that lots of times we're not getting those intervals when it's safe and when it's time to burn. And so like at times when we're not being able, like we've had springs where we haven't put fire on the ground because we've gone from like snow to like super dry in a week, and there's just not that interval there. Again, there's, as lots of people too talk about, like this lost knowledge of cultural fire, right? And I actually hate that term because it's like the knowledge wasn't lost. It was, as I said multiple times, ripped from people. Like it wasn't our choice for that knowledge to go away. And so what we really need is opportunities within communities to kind of relearn these practices, relearn when it's safe and in time to burn, and rebuild those connections to the land that we have.
Thanks, Amy. I think I was chatting with you once before, and I remember we talked about something in a similar vein, and you had shared a picture of you and your kids out. And I remember you made a joke about how sometimes you'll often see like the women in flip-flops doing burning, and how it's so different compared to when you go out on like a government hazard reduction burn and everyone's in full nomax and they have an ATV and a water tank, and they have it set objective, it needs to be done. And I remember it hitting me so hard when we were having that conversation about just how different it is. I came up through operational and Western fire management, and then to see the other side, and it finally clicked for me that, you know, we're not talking about two things, because it says apple and orange, they're completely different. And I think you did a perfect job of capturing how much more goes into it, and following, you know, what the weather is telling you, what the grasses are telling you. You're not there for an objective, you're there to help.
Yeah. And I think too, agencies, lots of times I think the concern about cultural fire comes almost from agencies thinking that we want to take over their prescribed fire programs. It's like, that's not even close to, you know, it's so different, and prescribed fire is needed. Like our forests are so unhealthy. We need those folks in Nomex that are out there. We need heli torches. We need other things. Like no one's saying that we shouldn't be doing that, but there's a really beautiful relationship between, I think, prescribed fire, where agencies are going out and basically reclaiming or resetting land that would be unsafe to culturally burn. And then we can go to that land after and burn it in a safe way with our own techniques.
There was a really cool moment. I remember, Amy, you were talking about the difference in the way they sound. The difference between the way a prescribed fire sounds from like a Western management and a good fire, like for a Indigenous cultural burn, right? And the difference was that in the Indigenous cultural burn, you had kids laughing and kids playing, and you had people around, and it was life. There was activity going on, whereas the RX burn was it's prescriptive. It's just like, we need to get rid of this hazard, period, right? It just sounds like fire and ATVs and radios going off, right? And I think, yeah, it paints a very different picture in your mind when you realize that this is not, they're very different things.
Yeah, that I think that clip actually is featured on the Reverberations Nature of Cities website. Right. So that one bit, yeah, because that's all about sound. And they look at like the 4 elements, and one is fire. And so they look kind of at the sounds of fire. And I think they feature a clip from us talking about that. So yeah, if you want to hear just that clip, go to that website there.
Thanks for that. There is one more question in the chat. Acknowledging that's very tricky, and feel free to pass if you don't want to answer. But it's if you were given unlimited time, money, resources, etc., where would you want to go with the Good Fire podcast?
You should start, Amy.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a really good question. I think for me, like, I mean, probably most people would say like to produce more regularly. But I think that's almost the beauty of Good Fire, is that we don't. And it's such a small group of in Indigenous fire that I worry something like that as well would just oversaturate like the landscape and the message. I think what I would like to see is like Good Fire gatherings related to the podcast, you know, where we can have guests from the podcast come on the land and teach and learn with people. Like, I think that would be my ultimate goal if we had money, that like the Good Fire podcast could sponsor that type of thing, which is probably not what you were thinking. But yeah, I think that's almost where I would go with it. Like a podcast is good, but I think you also have to, there's just things we need to be careful about, that we're not boring people or losing the originality of the message.
Yeah, I agree. I think the one thing that, given unlimited resources, that could be done, well, two things we could do. I guess we could do a little bit better production quality. That would help. if we had someone who actually knew how to properly edit and make it sound like a Hollywood style podcast, but still have the authenticity of the conversations, right? So that's minor though. That doesn't, I don't think that really matters quite so much. The one thing that I think would make a huge difference in the, getting the word out would be if we had like a full-time social media person who was
Yeah.
just, that was their job, just pushing that information out there and paying for advertisements. I think that's the big difference between podcasts that really explode and have, hundreds of thousands or millions of views, is they've got money going into advertisements. But at the same time, this is a very specific topic, and not the whole world is going to want to learn about it. So it's not like a comedy podcast or something like that where it's going to have 1 billion downloads, right? But I do think there would be a huge amount of value, and there would be a huge influx of listeners if we had, more of those resources to actually just have a constant representation online, so that people know that it's out there and ready to listen to. I think that's probably the biggest thing that any podcast could gain from, would just be someone doing that kind of a push.
Yeah, and like we said, I feel like I'm poor at it. Like, my way of promoting is usually just putting out a tweet or something. So it's very pathetic.
Yeah, the power of the comms person, hey?
Yeah.
We could all afford a comms team.
Yeah.
There was another question here, fairly generic question, just wondering, I think this is to Amy, who would you coordinate a Good Fire with? And I would assume this would vary very much depending on where you're talking. If the person who posted the question wants to provide more context in the chat, feel free to, but do you have any insights on coordination of Good Fire, Amy?
Yeah, I mean, it depends on, like, the thing with Good Fire Night, we just heard this the other day from an elder, was that like there's, we have the fire triangle, but really there's a fourth side to the fire triangle, and for Good Fire, and that's culture. So technically, like, if you aren't part of the culture in your area, like the Indigenous culture, like, you should be looking to support Indigenous people that are part of the culture and doing the work, and not looking kind of to do it yourself. And there's lots of different ways for allyship we talk about with the Good Fire podcast. So yeah, I think that's just one thing that I would say, is if you are an Indigenous person, like, go to your elders, to other knowledge holders. We do have some networks and connections now in Canada. There's the Indigenous Peoples Burning Network in the States that's looking to expand internationally. So there are different groups that you can reach out to get information from. But again, it has to be done. It's just like a prescribed fire. There's a specific set of knowledges that you need before putting any fire on the ground, because like we said, there's always is a little bit of a risk. Or I shouldn't say just a little risk. In the environment we're now with climate change and drought, there's actually a massive risk. So yeah, I would just recommend reaching out to kind of local networks and people in your area. And if no one is burning in your area, there aren't elders, that you can talk to. There are different exchanges and other things. And like we said, these kind of more national networks that you can also reach out to start getting involved and informed.
Thanks, Amy. We've got a couple minutes left. If there are any last minute questions, feel free to post them in the chat.
Yeah, thanks to those that stuck around. It's a long conversation on podcasting, but
incredibly informative. And I think not just on podcasting, but people can take so much from this from different perspectives, even just basic science communication. I think this is definitely a session that would be very valuable to a lot of graduate students coming through. And It's a very broad topic as well. And I personally appreciate all of the insights and the openness. There's no, both of your ability to be so open and share your experiences and the hard work you've put in and the lessons you've learned and the things that you've stumbled through so that maybe someone else doesn't have to is very much appreciated. So I'm just saying thank you. Matthew or Amy, do you have any last minute things that you'd like to mention, chat about before we close off for the day?
Go listen to Good Fire. Share it on your social medias.
So,
Karen, to you, Renee, Emily, Brian, like the team there at Canada Wildfire. Yeah, thanks for your support in this. And yeah, looking forward to continue working together.
Yeah, it's been fantastic.
We're so happy to be able to help support, and it's great work that needs to go out. I did post a link to the Good Fire podcast through Canada Wildfire's website. Perhaps in the interest of keeping those downloads and streams high, you'd be better served to go to Spotify or a different service directly to download. I'm not sure if the direct streams off of our website count towards their numbers. And if you do go listen, please leave them a review. We learned how important that is. So I'd like to thank Amy and Matthew for joining us today. I hope you both have a wonderful weekend. And thank you so much for being here.